I never thought I'd hear from Linda again. 3 years. 3 long years since she walked out on us, leaving behind nothing but an empty closet and a bitter taste of betrayal. And then, out of the blue, she called. Her voice was so familiar yet distant, like hearing an old song you once loved but can't remember the lyrics to. I wasn't ready for this. Not after everything. My mom, if I can even call her that anymore, had a way of disappearing when life got messy. It wasn't just the day she left, it was years of emotional absence before that. When I was 16, I started noticing the cracks. She'd come home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. She'd spend hours texting on her phone, her face lighting up in ways it never did around us. I pretended not to notice at first. What kid wants to believe their mom is capable of something like that? But the signs were there, plain as day. Missed dinners, forgotten birthdays, and that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach every time she smiled at her phone instead of at us. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. Turns out, I wasn't. The truth about Linda didn't come all at once, it unraveled slowly, like pulling on a loose thread until the whole fabric falls apart. I think I knew before I knew. Maybe it was the way her laughter sounded forced at the dinner table or how she started dressing up for no apparent reason. She wasn't the same Linda, the mom who used to braid Rachel's hair before school or cheer the loudest at Josh's soccer games. She was distracted. Distant. Like she was living in a different world, one we weren't invited into. The actual discovery, though, was brutal. It was one of those ordinary afternoons that end up defining everything. Dad was in his office, hunched over his laptop, trying to meet some deadline. Rachel was upstairs, probably watching makeup tutorials, and I was in the kitchen, half-heartedly doing homework. Linda had left her purse on the counter, which wasn't unusual, but her phone buzzed. And buzzed. And buzzed. I ignored it at first, her business was her business, but the sheer persistence of the notifications piqued my curiosity. The screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize, Frank. Can't wait to see you tonight, the message read, accompanied by a winking emoji. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the kind of text you send to a coworker or an old friend. It was intimate, teasing. I tried to tell myself there was an innocent explanation, but the way my hands trembled as I stared at the screen told me I didn't believe that. I should have stopped there, but I couldn't. It was like watching a car crash, you don't want to look, but you can't help it. So, I opened her phone. The passcode wasn't hard to guess, she always used our birthdays. I scrolled through the messages, each one worse than the last. There were pictures, too. Linda, smiling in ways I hadn't seen in years, her face lit up with a glow that wasn't for us. She was wearing a dress I didn't recognize, standing next to a man I'd never seen before. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. Time seemed to slow, and my mind raced. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw the phone across the room. But instead, I just stood there, frozen in place, until Dad walked in. "What's wrong, Stacy?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I must have looked pale, or maybe he just knew me well enough to sense something was off. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, like the words were choking me. Finally, I shoved the phone into his hands, unable to form a coherent sentence. He frowned, confused, and then his face changed as he read the messages. I'll never forget that look, the mixture of heartbreak, anger, and disbelief. It was like watching someone's world collapse in real time. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He just set the phone down on the counter, his hands trembling slightly. "I need to talk to your mom," he said, his voice low and steady in a way that scared me more than if he'd yelled. I nodded, still unable to speak. My mind was spinning with questions I didn't know how to ask. Who was Frank? How long had this been going on? Why wasn't I enough to keep her here? Dad waited until Linda got home that evening to confront her, but by then, the damage was done. We all knew. And nothing would ever be the same again. When Linda walked through the door that evening, she looked like she didn't have a care in the world. She was carrying a shopping bag, humming some tune under her breath, as if nothing in her life had fallen apart. The sight of her made my stomach churn. How could she act so normal, so carefree, when everything she'd built with us was on the verge of collapse? Dad wasted no time. He wasn't one for dramatic entrances, but there was a weight in the air as he stepped out of his office and met her in the hallway. I sat at the top of the stairs, out of sight but close enough to hear every word. "Linda," he said, his voice calm but cold. "We need to talk." She glanced at him, then at the shopping bag in her hand, her smile faltering. "Sure," she said, hesitant. "What's up? Who's Frank?" The words were like a bomb dropping in the middle of the room. No build-up, no softening the blow. Just the raw, blunt truth. I'll never forget the way her face changed. First came the confusion, her brows knitting together as if she didn't understand the question. Then came the flicker of panic, a quick flash of realization that she'd been caught. Finally, the mask slipped on, calm, composed, and defensive. "What are you talking about?" she asked, setting the bag down and crossing her arms. "I don't know anyone named Frank." Dad didn't flinch. "Don't lie to me, Linda. I've seen the messages. Stacy saw them too." Her eyes darted to the staircase for a split second, and I shrank back into the shadows. I wanted to disappear, to pretend I wasn't eavesdropping on the single most devastating moment of my family's life. But I couldn't leave. I had to hear it. She sighed, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice tinged with annoyance. "You're making something out of nothing." Dad stepped closer to her, his voice steady but sharper now. "Don't insult my intelligence. I read everything. I saw the pictures. Just tell me the truth. How long has this been going on?" Linda's defenses crumbled just a little. She leaned against the wall, rubbing her temples like the weight of the world had suddenly fallen on her shoulders. "It's not what you think," she said quietly, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Then tell me what it is," Dad pressed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around behind our backs with some guy while pretending everything's fine." Her voice broke when she answered. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. It just did. There it was. The truth. Simple and cruel. It just did. Like her betrayal was some inevitable act of nature, not a choice she made over and over again. Dad's face hardened, but he didn't raise his voice. "You didn't mean for it to happen. That's your excuse. What about Stacy? Rachel? Josh? Did you think about them when you were sneaking around?" She flinched, her composure cracking further. "I wasn't happy, Ed," she said, her voice trembling now. "I felt trapped. Stuck in this life where I was just a mother and a wife. I needed more. I needed to feel alive." Her words hit like a slap. Even from the stairs, I could feel their sting. She wasn't just admitting to cheating, she was saying we weren't enough for her. That I wasn't enough. Dad let out a bitter laugh. "So your solution was to destroy your family? To run off with some guy and leave us all to pick up the pieces? That's how you fix things?" "I didn't plan on leaving," she said quickly. "I just—" "But you did," Dad interrupted, his voice finally rising. "You already left us, Linda. Maybe not physically, but you've been gone for months. And now, here we are, trying to figure out what's left of this family while you're chasing whatever more you think you deserve." There was a long silence. I could hear the clock ticking in the living room, each second stretching out like an eternity. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Dad shook his head, his shoulders slumping like the weight of her betrayal was finally too much to bear. It's too late for that, he said. You already did. I heard footsteps then, Linda walking away, heading upstairs to her room. Dad stayed in the hallway for a long time, staring at the floor. I wanted to go to him, to tell him I was sorry, even though none of this was my fault. But I couldn't move. I felt like I was frozen in place, listening to the echoes of a family that would never be the same. The days that followed felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare. The house was unnervingly quiet, as though even it was morning. Rachel had no idea what was going on at first. Dad thought she was too young to understand, and I wasn't sure how to explain it to her without shattering the innocent image she still had of Linda. Josh, on the other hand, seemed to know something was wrong. He wasn't much for words, but his silence that week was heavier than usual, like he was holding everything in. And me? I didn't know how to feel. I was angry, yes. Furious, even. How could Linda do this to us? To Dad? He didn't deserve this. None of us did. But beneath the anger was a raw, aching sadness that I couldn't shake. I felt betrayed, not just by what she did, but by who she had become. She wasn't the mom who used to kiss our foreheads goodnight or bake cupcakes for school events. She wasn't my mom anymore. She was a stranger who had chosen someone else over us. Dad tried to stay strong for us, but I could see the cracks. He was quieter than usual, his laughter replaced by long, heavy sighs when he thought no one was watching. At night, I'd hear him pacing in his office, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Once, I even heard him crying. That sound, his muffled sobs through the thin walls, broke me in a way I didn't know was possible. He was always the strong one, the steady one. Seeing him crumble like that made everything feel so much worse. I spent a lot of time in my room, replaying everything in my head like a bad movie. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over again. Was this my fault? Could I have done something to stop her? Should I have told Dad about the text sooner? The guilt was suffocating, even though I knew, deep down, that none of this was on me. One night, Rachel came into my room, clutching her favorite stuffed animal, a bunny Linda had given her years ago. She climbed into bed next to me without saying a word, curling up like she used to when she was little and had bad dreams. Is Mom mad at us? She asked softly, her voice trembling. My throat tightened. How do you explain something like this to a 10-year-old? I wanted to tell her the truth, to let her know that Linda's choices had nothing to do with us. But all I could manage was, no, Rach. She's not mad at us. Then why is she so sad all the time? She whispered. I didn't have an answer for that. Instead, I wrapped my arms around her and held her close, hoping that somehow, my presence would be enough to shield her from the storm brewing around us. As for me, the sadness eventually gave way to something darker, resentment. Every time I thought about Linda, about her selfishness, it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I hated her for what she'd done to us, for the lies and the secrets and the way she made us feel like we weren't enough. But even with all that anger, there was a part of me that still missed her. That stupid, childish part that just wanted her mom back, even if I knew she wasn't coming. Dad sat us down one evening a few days later. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days, but his voice was steady. I want you to know that none of this is your fault, he said, looking each of us in the eye. What your mom did, it's on her, not you. And no matter what happens, we're going to be okay. I promise. I wanted to believe him, but it was hard. How could we be okay when everything we knew had been torn apart? Still, there was something comforting in his words, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd find a way to move forward. But even as I clung to that hope, the pain lingered. It wasn't the kind of hurt that fades overnight, it was deep, like a scar that would take years to heal. And as much as I tried to push it down, it was always there, a constant reminder of the betrayal that changed everything. Dad's decision didn't come immediately, it wasn't the kind of thing you could rush. In the days and weeks following Linda's confession, he was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, and an unshakable sense of betrayal. I think a part of him wanted to believe there was still something left to salvage, some shred of the woman he had married buried beneath all the lies. But the rest of him knew better. We all knew better. The turning point came one night when Linda tried to talk to him. I wasn't supposed to hear, but their voices carried through the walls. She was crying, pleading with him to give her another chance. I made a mistake, she kept saying, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. I didn't mean to hurt you. Dad's response was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade. A mistake is forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning, he said. What you did was a choice. And every time you lied to me, every time you came home and looked me in the eye while sneaking around behind my back, you made that choice again. This isn't something you can just apologize for and expect to go away. She kept pushing, trying to justify her actions. I wasn't happy, Ed. I felt invisible. You think I didn't feel the same way sometimes? He shot back, his voice rising. Marriage isn't always easy, Linda. But when things got hard, I stayed. I didn't go looking for an escape. That was the moment I realized it was over. There was no coming back from this. Linda had broken something in our family that couldn't be fixed with apologies or promises. And Dad, for all his love and patience, knew it too. The next morning, he sat us down in the living room. His face was calm, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that I'd never seen before. I've made a decision, he said, his voice steady. Your mom and I are separating. Rachel gasped, her little hands clutching the hem of her shirt. Josh just sat there, staring at the floor. As for me, I didn't know whether to feel relief or despair. A part of me had been waiting for this, expecting it, even, but hearing the words out loud made it real in a way that hit harder than I thought it would. Are you getting divorced? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly. Yes. I don't see another way forward. This isn't something we can fix. Rachel started crying then, big, hiccuping sobs that tore at my heart. Dad pulled her into his arms, whispering soothing words as she clung to him like a lifeline. I wanted to cry too, but the tears wouldn't come. I was too numb, too overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Linda wasn't there for the conversation. She had gone to stay with a friend, or maybe with Frank, though no one said it out loud. She didn't fight the divorce. If anything, she seemed resigned to it, as if she had known all along this was where her choices would lead. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, awkward conversations, and painful goodbyes. Linda came by a few times to pick up her things, but the visits were brief and strained. She tried to talk to us, to explain herself, but none of us were ready to listen. Not yet. For Dad, the resolution was clear, he would do everything in his power to make sure we were okay. He threw himself into his work, his writing becoming both an escape and a source of strength. He started cooking dinners again, something he hadn't done in years, and made a point of spending more time with us. It wasn't perfect, there were still cracks in the foundation, and the pain didn't just vanish overnight, but it was a start. For me, the decision brought a strange sense of closure. I hated what Linda had done, and I didn't know if I would ever fully forgive her. But I also realized that holding on to the anger would only hurt me in the end. So I let it sit there, quietly, while I focused on the people who had stayed, Dad, Rachel, and Josh. They were my family now, and we were going to figure this out together. And Linda? She had made her bed. Now, she had to lie in it. Looking back now, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when I stopped feeling the sharp sting of Linda's betrayal. Maybe it was gradual, like a wound that heals so slowly you barely notice it. Or maybe it was the day I realized that her choices didn't define me, that her leaving wasn't the end of us, but the start of something new. Dad once told me that pain has a way of either breaking you or building you. At first, I thought that was just one of those things people say to make themselves feel better, but over time, I saw the truth in it. Losing Linda forced all of us to grow in ways we never expected. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't fair, but it shaped us into the family we are today, flawed, resilient, and stronger than we ever thought we could be. For me, the biggest lesson was learning how to let go of the things I couldn't control. I couldn't change what Linda did or force her to be the person I needed her to be. But I could choose how I responded. I could hold on to the bitterness and let it consume me, or I could focus on the people who stayed, the people who mattered. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one. I also learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Forgiving Linda wasn't about letting her back into my life, it was about freeing myself from the weight of her actions. It was about saying, you don't get to control how I feel anymore. And while I wouldn't say I've fully forgiven her, there are still moments when the hurt bubbles up. I'm working on it. For me, not for her. If I had any advice to give someone going through something similar, it would be this: let yourself feel everything. The anger, the sadness, the confusion, don't bottle it up or try to rush through it. Healing isn't linear, and there's no right way to do it. Just take it one day at a time, and don't be afraid to lean on the people who love you. They'll remind you of who you are when you feel like you've lost yourself. I don't know what the future holds for Linda. Maybe she's happy with Frank, living the life she thought she wanted. Or maybe she wakes up every day wondering what might have been if she'd made different choices. Either way, it's not my burden to carry anymore. She's a part of my story, but she doesn't get to write the ending. As for us, we're still figuring things out, one step at a time. Dad's doing better than ever, his writing has taken off in ways he never imagined, and Rachel and Josh are thriving. We're not perfect, and we never will be, but we're okay. And after everything, that's enough for me. If Linda ever thought her leaving would break us, she underestimated Dad, and us, for that matter. It wasn't easy at first, in fact, it was downright messy. There were nights when the house felt suffocatingly quiet, like we were holding our breath, waiting for something to fill the void she left behind. But Dad didn't let us wallow in it for too long. He wasn't just determined to survive, he was determined to make sure we thrived. The first few months were all about survival. Dad took on more responsibilities than ever, juggling work, parenting, and everything else Linda used to handle. He learned how to braid Rachel's hair before school, even though his first attempts were pretty disastrous. He started cooking dinner every night, experimenting with recipes from YouTube that often ended in burnt edges or too much salt. We teased him about it, but deep down, we appreciated the effort. It wasn't just the little things, though. Dad made it his mission to rebuild our lives, one piece at a time. He started going to therapy, something he'd never considered before, and encouraged us to go too. He didn't force it on us, he just let us know it was okay to need help. I think that's what made the difference, knowing we didn't have to face it all alone. Rachel, my younger sister, blossomed in ways none of us saw coming. She had always been shy, the kind of kid who clung to Linda's leg at family gatherings. But after Linda left, something shifted. Rachel started taking dance classes at Dad's suggestion, and before we knew it, she was signing up for modeling competitions. Watching her strut down a runway for the first time was surreal. She went from a quiet, uncertain girl to this confident, radiant force of nature. It was like she found a piece of herself that had been missing all along. Josh, on the other hand, had a harder time. He was angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him. At 17, he was already dealing with the usual teenage stuff, and Linda's betrayal only added fuel to the fire. He started skipping school, hanging out with the wrong crowd, and pushing boundaries just to see how far he could go. But Dad didn't give up on him. He set firm rules, gave him tough love when he needed it, and showed up for him in ways that Linda never had. Slowly but surely, Josh started turning things around. He got into woodworking, of all things, and now he's planning to open his own furniture business someday. And then there was Dad. If anyone deserved to be bitter and broken, it was him. But instead, he rose from the ashes like some kind of phoenix. He started writing again, not just the technical stuff he used to do for work, but real, heartfelt pieces about life, love, and loss. His writing caught the attention of a small publisher, and before we knew it, his first book was out in the world. It wasn't a bestseller overnight, but it gained momentum, and people started noticing him. By the time his second book came out, he was being invited to speak at conferences and events. Watching him on stage, so calm and composed, made me realize just how far he'd come. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Our family found a rhythm without Linda, one that felt stronger and more authentic than anything we'd had before. We laughed more. We leaned on each other more. We became a team in a way we never had when she was around. It didn't erase the pain of her leaving, but it made us realize that we didn't need her to define us. We were so much more than the sum of her choices. If Linda could see us now, I wonder what she'd think. Would she regret leaving? Would she feel proud of what we've become, even though she had no part in it? I guess it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we've built something beautiful out of the wreckage she left behind. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're exactly where we're meant to be. I never thought our family would become the kind of people who were invited to fancy galas or featured in glossy magazine spreads, but somehow, that's exactly what happened. And it was all because of Dad. After Linda left, he threw himself into his writing, not just as a way to process everything, but as a way to prove to himself, and maybe to her, too, that he could build something meaningful on his own. What started as a small, personal project turned into something much bigger than any of us expected. His first book, The Phoenix Within, was raw and deeply personal. It wasn't just about Linda or the pain she caused, it was about resilience, about finding strength in the face of adversity. People connected with it in ways I don't think Dad even imagined. It was like he had given a voice to the feelings so many people were too afraid to express. Readers wrote to him, sharing their own stories of heartbreak and healing, and his words started to spread like wildfire. By the time his second book, Rise from the Ashes, hit the shelves, Dad wasn't just an author, he was a name. He started getting invited to speak at events, sharing his story with rooms full of people who hung on his every word. At first, he was nervous. Public speaking wasn't exactly his strong suit, but the more he did it, the more natural it became. Watching him up there, standing tall and confident, it was hard to believe this was the same man who had once cried alone in his office, thinking his world had ended. And with Dad's success came new opportunities for all of us. Suddenly, we were part of this world that had once seemed so far out of reach. Prestigious literary events, charity galas, even exclusive dinner parties where everyone seemed to know who we were. I'll admit, it was overwhelming at first. We weren't used to this kind of attention, and for a while, it felt like we were just playing dress up, pretending to belong in a world that wasn't ours. But over time, we realized that we did belong, because we had earned our place there. Rachel, of course, thrived in this new environment. Her modeling career took off in ways none of us expected. She started booking bigger gigs, walking runways in cities like New York and Paris, and landing spots in major campaigns. I remember the first time I saw her face on a billboard, it was surreal, like a dream come true for her. She was still the same Rachel to us, though, funny, down-to-earth, and fiercely loyal to her family. She always said that no matter how far she went, she'd never forget where she came from. And she meant it. Josh was a little slower to embrace the changes. He wasn't exactly the black tie event type, and he hated the idea of being in the spotlight. But even he couldn't deny the benefits that came with Dad's success. His woodworking business started to gain traction, thanks in part to the connections he made through Dad's network. People admired his craftsmanship and his story, how he had turned his life around and found a passion that gave him purpose. He didn't seek out the attention, but when it came to him, he handled it with quiet grace. As for me, I found my own way to navigate this new chapter of our lives. I started helping Dad with his public appearances, managing his schedule and making sure everything ran smoothly. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave me a sense of purpose, and, honestly, a way to stay close to him. We became a team, in a way. I think it helped him to know I was by his side, and it helped me to see how far we'd all come. But with all this newfound success came a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I was proud of what we had achieved, proud of Dad for turning something so painful into something so powerful. On the other hand, I couldn't help but think about Linda. She had left us, chasing some illusion of a better life, and yet here we were, living a reality that was better than anything she could have imagined. It was ironic, really, she left to find happiness, but in doing so, she gave us the chance to find our own. The defining moment came at one of Dad's events, a massive literary gala held in this stunning old ballroom with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows. Dad had just finished his speech, and the room erupted in applause. As he stepped off the stage, a woman approached him, gushing about how much his words had meant to her. She introduced herself as the editor of a prominent magazine and asked if he'd be willing to do a feature. "I'd love to include your family in the piece," she said, glancing at Rachel and me. "You all seem so inspiring." It was a surreal moment, hearing someone describe us as inspiring. I looked at Dad, and for the first time, I saw him smile without a trace of the pain that had once haunted him. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, and now, people admired him for it. We admired him for it. As we drove home that night, Rachel leaned her head against the car window, staring at the city lights. "Do you think Mom knows about all this?" she asked quietly. Dad didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said eventually. "But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we've built something she couldn't take away. And no one can ever take that from us." I didn't say anything, but his words stayed with me. He was right. We weren't defined by Linda's choices anymore. We were defined by how we had risen above them. And that, more than anything, was what made us strong. I don't know when Linda started to notice what was happening with us. Maybe it was through mutual acquaintances, whispers of our family's newfound success drifting back to her. Or maybe it was the day she stumbled across Dad's book, sitting on a shelf in some upscale bookstore, her name disguised in a thin veil of fiction but unmistakably present in every page. From what I've pieced together, it hit her hardest when she realized her partner, Frank, was one of Dad's fans. The irony was almost too much to bear. Frank, the man she had chosen over us, raved about this incredible author named David Voles, completely unaware that David Voles was actually Ed, the man Linda had left behind. I imagine the moment she put it together must have been jarring. Maybe she was sitting on the couch, listening to Frank praise the way Dad wrote about resilience and redemption. Maybe she saw the book cover on the coffee table, picked it up out of curiosity, and felt the blood drain from her face as she read the words. Or maybe she knew the second she read Dad's pseudonym. It wouldn't have surprised me, after all, she used to know him better than anyone. Whatever the case, it must have been a gut punch. Here was Dad, the man she had once accused of being too predictable, too uninspiring, now thriving in a way she had never imagined. And not just him, us. Her children, who she had left behind to chase her version of happiness, had grown into confident, successful people without her. We didn't just survive her absence, we thrived in it. Dad didn't tell us this, but I later found out that Linda sent him an email after discovering the book. She congratulated him on his success, said she was proud of him, and admitted that reading his words had forced her to confront things she'd been avoiding for years. She talked about her regrets, about how she had underestimated him and the life they had built together. "I didn't realize what I was giving up," she wrote. "And now it's too late." Dad didn't respond. He didn't need to. As far as he was concerned, her realization wasn't his problem anymore. She had made her choices, and he had made his peace with them. But for Linda, I think the realization was a turning point, though not in the way she might have hoped. The next time she called me, her voice was softer than I remembered, tinged with something that sounded like regret. "Stacy," she said, "I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to see you and your siblings. Just to talk." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no, either. I told her I'd think about it and hung up, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Part of me wanted to see her, to hear her out, to understand what had been going through her mind all those years. But another part of me, the part that still carried the weight of her betrayal, didn't think she deserved that chance. Later that night, I told Dad about the call. He didn't try to sway me one way or the other, he just listened. "It's your decision," he said. "But whatever you choose, make sure it's for you, not for her. You don't owe her anything." His words stuck with me. Linda's realization, her regret, her guilt, wasn't something I had to fix. It wasn't my job to make her feel better about her choices. But it was a reminder of how far we'd come, of everything we'd built in her absence. And if she wanted to be a part of our lives again, she'd have to prove she deserved that chance. I wasn't ready to decide yet. But for the first time in years, I felt like the one holding the cards. Linda's realization didn't give her power over us, it gave us power over what came next. And for now, that was enough. It didn't take long for Linda's realization about Dad's success to become a running joke between me and Rachel. The fact that her new partner, Frank, was an enthusiastic fan of Dad's work was almost too good to be true. Life has a funny way of serving up karma, and this was like a dish served with an extra side of irony. Rachel was the first to bring it up when we were sitting in her apartment one evening. She was flipping through a magazine featuring an interview with Dad, smiling at a photo of him standing in front of shelves lined with his books. Can you imagine Linda's face when she realized her favorite author's biggest fan is literally dating her, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I burst out laughing, imagining the scene. I bet she tried to play it cool, but you know she panicked. Can you picture Frank, sitting there, reading passages about betrayal and resilience, saying, "Wow, this David guy really gets it," while Linda's sweating bullets next to him? Rachel smirked. I hope she was dying inside. I mean, what are the odds? We joked about it for weeks, coming up with increasingly ridiculous scenarios of how Linda might have handled it. In one version, we imagined Frank asking her to join him at one of Dad's book signings, oblivious to the tension it would create. In another, we pictured her frantically trying to keep Frank from quoting Dad's books at dinner parties. Even Josh, who usually stayed out of these conversations, couldn't help but chuckle when I told him about it. "So let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The guy Mom left us for basically worships the ground Dad walks on. That's poetic." "It's almost Shakespearean," I said, grinning. "You couldn't write a better plot twist." But the humor wasn't just about laughing at Linda's misfortune, it was about reclaiming the power she once held over us. For so long, her choices had loomed like a dark cloud over our family, but now, they were just another chapter in a story that didn't belong to her anymore. By finding the humor in the situation, we were taking control of the narrative, turning her betrayal into something we could laugh about instead of cry over. Of course, the awkwardness wasn't lost on Dad. He didn't talk about Linda much, but one night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I asked him how he felt about the whole situation. He shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'll admit, it's surreal. But at the end of the day, it's not about her or Frank. It's about us. And honestly, if my words are helping people, even him, then that's what matters." I nodded, impressed by his ability to rise above it all. But then he added, though I can't deny, the irony is pretty satisfying. We both laughed, and for a moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. Linda's actions had once torn us apart, but now, they were just another piece of a larger story, a story of resilience, growth, and, yes, a little bit of karmic justice. If Linda ever realized we were laughing about her situation, I don't know how she would have felt. Maybe she'd be embarrassed, or maybe she'd finally see how little power she had over us now. Either way, it didn't really matter. What mattered was that we had found a way to move forward, to take the pain she caused and turn it into something that made us stronger, and maybe even a little happier. When Linda called again a few weeks later, her tone was tentative, almost shy. It was such a stark contrast to the confident, often commanding presence I remembered her having. It was strange to hear her sound so unsure, so vulnerable. "Stacy," she began, pausing as if searching for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said before. About wanting to see you, Rachel, and Josh. I know I have no right to ask this, but I'd really like to reconnect. Even if it's just for a little while." I could hear the faint tremble in her voice, the hesitation that hinted at guilt. Part of me wanted to cut her off, to tell her she didn't get to waltz back into our lives now that we had found stability and success without her. But the other part, the part that still missed having a mom, hesitated. Despite everything, I couldn't ignore the flicker of curiosity. Did she really mean it? Did she want to change? Or was this just another selfish move in a long line of selfish moves? "I'm not saying no," I replied cautiously. "But if this happens, it's going to be on our terms. I need to talk to Rachel and Josh first, and we'll set the boundaries. If you can't respect that, then there's no point in even trying." She didn't argue. In fact, she sounded relieved. "Of course. I'll do whatever it takes. I just want a chance to make things right. I didn't make any promises." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone and replaying the conversation in my head. Was this some sort of closure she was seeking, or did she genuinely want to rebuild the bridges she had burned? And more importantly, were we ready to let her try? When I brought it up with Rachel and Josh, their reactions were as different as their personalities. Rachel furrowed her brow, her usual warmth replaced by a wary skepticism. "Why now?" she asked. "Why does she care all of a sudden? She didn't care when I needed her. She didn't care when you and Dad were doing everything to keep us afloat. So what changed?" "I don't know," I admitted. But she sounded different. Like she regrets what she did. Rachel rolled her eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Regret doesn't erase years of abandonment, Stacy. It doesn't fix anything." Josh, on the other hand, shrugged. "I mean, if she wants to try, what's the harm? Worst case scenario, she screws it up again, and we know not to bother anymore. But maybe, just maybe, she's actually serious this time." It was strange hearing that from him. Josh had been the angriest of all of us after Linda left, the most vocal about how much he hated her for what she did. But over the years, he had softened. Maybe it was because he had found his own path, or maybe he just didn't want to carry that anger anymore. Either way, his openness surprised me. In the end, we decided to meet her, but not without setting ground rules. We would meet in a neutral place, somewhere public, so none of us would feel trapped. We agreed to keep it short, just coffee, no long emotional talks or dramatic confrontations. And if Linda pushed too hard, if she crossed any lines, we'd walk away. No second chances. When I called her back to tell her, she sounded genuinely grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll be there. Whenever and wherever you want." The plan was set, but as the date approached, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. What did she want from us? What could she possibly say to make up for everything she had done? And would I even be able to listen without all the old anger and pain bubbling to the surface? I didn't have answers to any of those questions, but one thing was clear, this wasn't just about Linda anymore. It was about us, me, Rachel, and Josh, and how we would face this next chapter together. If we were going to let her back in, even a little, we needed to be sure it was what we wanted, not what she needed. The ball was in our court now, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, I felt like I was walking into a battlefield. Rachel and I drove together, the silence in the car thick with unspoken tension. Josh was already waiting at the cafe, claiming he wanted to get there early to scope the place out, though I knew it was just his way of avoiding the awkward car ride. Linda was supposed to meet us there at 2 p.m., and by 1:45, my stomach was already in knots. Rachel broke the silence as we pulled into the parking lot. "Do you think she's going to cry?" she asked, her voice laced with the dry sarcasm she used as a shield. "Probably," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But I'm not sure if it'll be because she's sorry or because she feels sorry for herself." Rachel gave a short laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. Either way, I'm not holding her hand. When we walked into the cafe, Josh was seated at a table near the back, a cup of coffee in his hands. He glanced up when he saw us, giving a small nod. "She's not here yet," he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Figured she'd show up early to make a good impression." "She probably wants to make an entrance," Rachel muttered, sliding into the seat next to him. I sat down across from her, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. By 2:05, Linda finally arrived. She hesitated at the door, scanning the room until she spotted us. Her smile was tentative, almost apologetic, as she made her way over to our table. She looked different, older, yes, but also, smaller, somehow. Less sure of herself. For a moment, I barely recognized her as the woman who had once ruled our household with an iron will. "Hi," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. "Thank you for meeting me." We didn't respond right away. Josh gave a curt nod, Rachel sipped her coffee without looking at her, and I gestured to the empty chair. Linda sat down, clutching her purse like it was some kind of lifeline. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted, her eyes darting between us. "I know I don't deserve this. I wanted to see you. To talk." "Then talk," Rachel said bluntly, setting her cup down with a little more force than necessary. Linda flinched at the sharpness in her tone but didn't argue. She took a deep breath, then began. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "And I know I can't undo what I did. But I've had a lot of time to think about my choices, about why I left, and what I lost because of it." She paused, glancing around the table like she was hoping for a response. When none of us spoke, she continued. "I was selfish. I thought I needed something more, something better, and I convinced myself that leaving was the only way to find it. But I was wrong. I see that now. And I know it's too late to fix things, but I want you to know how sorry I am." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unsteady. I wanted to believe her, to think that she had truly changed, but I couldn't ignore the years of pain and silence that had followed her departure. Apologies were easy. Redemption was not. "Why now?" Josh asked, his voice calm but firm. "Why do you care all of a sudden?" Linda hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Because I realized how much I lost," she said quietly. "When I saw how far you've all come, how strong you've become without me, it made me see how much I gave up. I thought I was chasing happiness, but instead, I left behind everything that actually mattered." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "So we're supposed to be your redemption arc now? Is that it?" "No," Linda said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not asking for anything. I just want a chance to be part of your lives again. Even if it's just a small part." The three of us exchanged glances, unspoken questions passing between us. Could we trust her? Did we even want to? After everything she had done, could we let her back in, even a little? In the end, it was Josh who spoke up. "We'll think about it," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "But this isn't going to be easy. If you want to be part of our lives again, you're going to have to prove you're serious. Words aren't enough." Linda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." As we left the cafe that afternoon, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had come. Linda had spent years chasing what she thought she wanted, only to realize too late that the happiness she sought was something she already had, and threw away. It wasn't lost on me how much life had shifted since she left, how we had built something stronger in her absence. Karma had found Linda in its own way, forcing her to confront the consequences of her choices. And while I wasn't sure what the future held for us as a family, one thing was certain: whatever happened next, it would be on our terms. If there's one thing Linda's absence taught us, it's that we only had each other to lean on. Over the years, the bond between me, Rachel, and Josh grew stronger, shaped by shared pain and the determination to move forward without her. Each of us dealt with Linda's departure in our own way, but together, we formed a kind of unspoken pact: we'd look out for one another, no matter what. Rachel was the heart of the family in a lot of ways. Despite being the youngest, she had a way of bringing light into even the darkest moments. After Linda left, she threw herself into her modeling career, using it as both a distraction and a way to prove her own worth. I think part of her success came from wanting to show Linda what she was missing, but over time, it became about so much more than that. Rachel found confidence in herself, not as a way to spite Linda, but as a way to reclaim her own identity. She was still Rachel, though, quick with a sarcastic quip, always the first to call me out when I got too serious. "Don't overthink it, Stacy," she'd say whenever I started spiraling about whether or not to let Linda back into our lives. "She's the one who screwed up, not us. We're doing just fine without her." Josh, on the other hand, was more reserved. He'd always been the quiet one, the kind of person who internalized everything until it eventually boiled over. After Linda left, his anger was palpable. He stopped talking about her entirely, and for a while, it felt like he was carrying a grudge that would never go away. But as he found his footing, his passion for woodworking, his sense of purpose, he softened. He didn't forgive Linda, not really, but he let go of the bitterness that had weighed him down. Josh and I weren't as openly close as Rachel and I were, but he had a quiet way of showing he cared. When I'd vent about work or school, he'd listen without interrupting, offering a simple "that sucks" or "you'll figure it out" at the end. It didn't seem like much, but it always made me feel better. He wasn't one for big gestures, but when you really needed him, he was there, steady, dependable, and fiercely protective. And then there was me, the middle sibling, the one who tried to hold everything together. I wasn't as bold as Rachel or as quietly strong as Josh, but I found my role somewhere in between. I became the planner, the organizer, the one who made sure we didn't forget birthdays or skip family dinners. It wasn't a role I chose, exactly, it just kind of happened. Maybe it was my way of filling the void Linda left, or maybe it was how I coped. Either way, it kept me grounded. The three of us weren't perfect, of course. We fought like all siblings do. Rachel and I butted heads over petty things, and Josh had a way of retreating when we needed him to open up. But at the end of the day, we always had each other's backs. We were a team, a unit, and nothing, not even Linda, could break that. When we talked about whether or not to let Linda back into our lives, our dynamic played out in full force. Rachel was skeptical, vocal about her doubts and frustrations. "She doesn't get to just waltz back in and play mom again," she said one night, pacing back and forth in my living room. "She made her choice. She needs to live with it." Josh, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. "Yeah, but people change. Maybe she really is sorry. We don't have to let her all the way in, but what's the harm in seeing if she's serious? And what if she's not?" Rachel shot back. "What if she bails again? I'm not going through that twice." I don't think any of us are, I said quietly, trying to mediate. But if we're going to make a decision, we need to do it together. This affects all of us. That was the thing about us, we didn't always agree, but we always made decisions as a unit. We had spent too many years patching ourselves up after Linda's choices to let her drive a wedge between us now. In the end, it wasn't about what Linda wanted. It was about what we wanted, what felt right for us as siblings, as a family. We had grown so much without her, found strength in each other that we hadn't even known we had. And no matter what decision we made about Linda, that bond would remain unshaken. We had built something she couldn't take away, and that was all that mattered. The day Linda asked for another chance, a small part of me wanted to believe her. But hope is a tricky thing. It's fragile, tentative, especially when you've been burned before. Letting her back into our lives meant opening the door to a flood of emotions I wasn't sure any of us were ready for. It meant risking the fragile balance we'd worked so hard to build. After days of back-and-forth discussions between me, Rachel, and Josh, we decided to give her a chance. But it wasn't the kind of chance she might have been hoping for, it came with boundaries. Clear, unmovable boundaries. We agreed to meet her a few more times in neutral spaces, but no one was ready to bring her into the intimate fold of our lives. Let's not give her more than she deserves, Rachel said firmly. She's still got a long way to go. Josh nodded in agreement. Yeah. Let her prove herself. When I called Linda to tell her, I made sure to keep my tone neutral. We're willing to try, I said, carefully. But it's going to take time. You need to understand that. I do, she said quickly. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you so much. I'll do whatever it takes. Her eagerness felt genuine, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of doubt creeping in. People can say all the right things, but actions speak louder. I reminded myself that this wasn't about trusting her, it was about giving her the chance to rebuild that trust, one tiny brick at a time. The first few meetings were awkward. Painfully so. We'd meet at a cafe or a park, sticking to small talk and avoiding the heavy stuff. Linda would ask about Rachel's modeling gigs, Josh's woodworking, or my job, and we'd give short, polite answers. It felt like talking to a distant relative you hadn't seen in years, not the woman who was supposed to be our mom. Still, there were glimpses of something real beneath the surface. Linda seemed genuinely interested in our lives, though I wasn't sure if it was out of guilt or a true desire to reconnect. She complimented Rachel's confidence, praised Josh's craftsmanship, and told me how proud she was of the way I held the family together. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Like maybe, just maybe, she could fit into our lives again. But the uncertainty never left. There were still questions she hadn't answered, wounds that hadn't healed. And every time I started to feel hopeful, a little voice in the back of my mind reminded me of all the times she had let us down before. It was like walking on a tightrope, balancing between hope and doubt, wondering which side we'd fall on. Rachel was the most vocal about her hesitation. She's trying, I'll give her that, she said one night as we sat on her couch, scrolling through pictures of her latest photo shoot. But trying doesn't erase the fact that she left. That she chose Frank over us. She knows that, I said quietly. And I think she regrets it. Regret's not enough, Rachel replied, her tone sharp. She's going to have to do a hell of a lot more than regret. Josh, on the other hand, was cautiously optimistic. I think she's serious, he said after one of our meetings. She seems different. Like she's actually trying this time. Trying doesn't guarantee anything, I pointed out. No, but it's a start, he said. And maybe that's all we can ask for right now. As for me, I was stuck somewhere in the middle. Part of me wanted to believe Linda could change, that she could be the mother we had needed all along. But the other part of me, the part that remembered every tear, every lonely night, every moment of doubt, wasn't so sure. Hope was there, but it was wrapped in layers of uncertainty, and I didn't know which would win out in the end. When Linda asked if she could meet Dad, I knew we weren't ready for that step. One thing at a time, I told her firmly. We're still figuring this out. I understand, she said, though there was a flicker of disappointment in her voice. I'll wait as long as it takes. Her words were reassuring, but they didn't erase the doubt. Rebuilding a relationship isn't about grand gestures or quick fixes, it's about consistency, about showing up time and time again. And while Linda was saying the right things, I needed to see if her actions would follow. For now, we're navigating this uneasy middle ground, caught between the hope of what could be and the fear of being let down again. There's no clear path forward, no guarantee that this will end with a happy reunion. But there's one thing I know for sure, whatever happens, we're stronger now than we've ever been. And no matter what Linda does or doesn't do, we'll be okay. We've already proven that. In the weeks following our cautious attempts at reconnection with Linda, life felt like it was in limbo. On the surface, everything was progressing as it had been. Dad's career was thriving, Rachel's modeling gigs kept her busy, Josh's woodworking projects were gaining traction, and I was balancing work with family. But Linda's presence, tentative as it was, lingered in the background like a question we weren't ready to answer. Rachel and I had dinner together one night, just the two of us. She was dressed casually, her usual confident aura slightly dimmed as she swirled her glass of wine. "Do you ever think about how different things would have been if she'd stayed?" she asked suddenly, breaking the easy rhythm of our conversation. I paused, unsure how to answer. "Yeah, sometimes. But then I think, maybe we wouldn't have become who we are now." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I mean, look at Dad. Do you think he'd be this version of himself if she hadn't left? Would we have found our paths, or would we have been stuck in some dysfunctional mess, waiting for her to figure herself out?" It was a hard truth, but one I couldn't deny. As much as Linda's departure had hurt us, it had also forced us to grow in ways we might not have otherwise. And while I still felt the sting of her absence, I couldn't ignore the strength we had found in her wake. Josh, ever the pragmatist, had a different perspective. "Look, she's trying now," he said one afternoon when we were working on a project together. "She can't undo the past, but at least she's owning up to it. That's more than some people ever do." "But does that make it enough?" I asked, handing him a piece of sandpaper. He shrugged. "It's not about enough. It's about whether or not we want to give her the chance to be part of our lives again. She's not perfect. Hell, she's probably still a mess in a lot of ways. But if she's willing to show up and do the work, maybe it's worth seeing where it goes." That was the thing about Josh, he had a way of cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of things. And as much as I hated to admit it, he had a point. Linda couldn't erase the past, but she could try to be better in the future. The question was whether or not we were ready to let her. For her part, Linda seemed determined to prove herself. She didn't push too hard or try to force her way back into our lives. Instead, she showed up when we asked her to, listened more than she spoke, and made an effort to respect the boundaries we had set. It wasn't perfect, there were moments when old wounds resurfaced, when her presence felt more like a reminder of what we had lost than a step towards something new. But there were also moments when it felt like maybe, just maybe, we could build something different. One of those moments came during a quiet afternoon at a park. Linda had asked if we could all meet for a picnic, and while Rachel was initially reluctant, she agreed. We sat on the grass, eating sandwiches and watching kids play on a nearby playground. For a little while, it felt almost normal, like we were just another family enjoying a sunny day. As the afternoon wore on, Linda turned to Rachel, her expression soft. "I saw your latest campaign," she said. "You looked incredible. I'm so proud of you." Rachel hesitated, her walls momentarily slipping. "Thanks," she said quietly. "It was a big deal for me." Linda nodded, a small smile on her face. "It should be. You've worked so hard. I wish I had been there to see it." There was a beat of silence, heavy with unspoken emotion. But instead of snapping back with her usual sarcasm, Rachel simply said, "Well, you weren't. But I guess you're here now." It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. But it was a start. As we packed up to leave, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Not the naive, all-consuming kind I'd felt as a child, but a cautious, measured kind. The kind that understood things wouldn't be perfect but believed they could at least be better. Linda's place in our lives is still uncertain. She's not the mom we once knew, and maybe she never will be. But we're learning to navigate this new version of her, just as she's learning to navigate the people we've become. It's messy, complicated, and far from resolved. But for the first time, it feels like there's a possibility, however small, of something resembling peace. And that, I think, is enough for now.